Which of the following best describes the expected hemodynamic changes in this patient? So obviously cardio question, very cardio phys question. These are some of my favorite types. 62-year-old man comes to the clinic, call up after noticing reduced exercise tolerance and breathlessness when lying flat. So he's got orthopnea, history of untreated hypertension and repaired bicuspid aortic valve in childhood. On exam, his blood pressure is 160/55 and a diastolic murmur is heard best at the left sternal border, third intercostal space. Carotid upstroke is described as bounding. So let's localize the murmur first. That's always first up when you're doing these murmur questions. So diastolic helps us eliminate a lot, but let's start with a visual. Left sternal border, third intercostal space. So here we've got our all physicians take money mnemonic from right, the patient's right to left. This usually is at the second intercostal space. And then this is the fourth or fifth intercostal space for your tricuspid, and then mitral is typically at the fifth intercostal space. Which one of those says 3? Exactly, none of them. So what they're actually talking about is this little spot right between the two called Erb's point. Erb's point's interesting because this tends to be where you hear some strange diastolic murmurs. You can hear HCM, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, during systole, and you can also hear things like aortic or pulmonic regurg during diastole. Right here at Erb's point, and that is the third intercostal space. So if you ever see third intercostal space, think Erb's point. Another way they can describe it is just left sternal border. They won't say for P, like pulmonic area, they'll say upper left sternal border, or for tricuspid, they'll say lower left sternal border. If it's just left sternal border, it's probably Erb's point. And one last thing, if you're wondering, so I can hear pulmonic regurg here and at the pulmonic valve? Yes. I can hear aortic regurg here and at the aortic valve location? Yes, you can. So that's the weird thing. Erb's point, I feel like it's not touched on very much in med school, but this is possible to see. I do see this question more on USMLE than on COMLEX, but just so you know, in case you ever see it in the future. We have a lot of hints though, namely the bicuspid aortic valve repair in childhood is probably the biggest one. So I'm going to go with that. Let's say we're talking about an aortic regurg here. Now, stroke volume, EDV, and pulse pressure. Let's get some definitions going. I think it's always easiest if you start with defining things. All right, here are definitions. EDV, end diastolic volume. It's the pressure in the left ventricle at the end of diastole. So diastole normally means filling of the left ventricle. So it's just how much blood is in the left ventricle at the end of diastole. Stroke volume is end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume, or in other words, how much blood leaves the heart. Diastole, we're filling. Systole, we're contracting and emptying. So there should be less blood at the end of systole, more blood at the end of diastole. Pulse pressure is our systolic blood pressure minus our diastolic pressure. But let's make that make sense. What is diastolic blood pressure? I ask people this all the time and they have no idea. We throw these terms around, but it can be really useful if you just think about it and try to figure out what it actually means and make it make sense. So diastolic blood pressure, we're talking about systemically, like you're putting a blood pressure cuff on someone's arm and you're measuring their systolic and diastolic pressure. I'm not talking about cardiac cath pressure, which is the pressures inside of the heart. We're talking about systemic pressure. Diastolic pressure is the force of blood in the vasculature, and that's primarily dictated by how much blood volume you have. So give you an example, if you have more blood, you're gonna have more diastolic pressure. If you have less blood, you'll have less pressure. And vascular tone, how constricted or dilated your arteries are. If you have a lot of vasoconstriction, you're going to have a lot more pressure. A lot of vasodilation, you'll have a lot less pressure. All right, systolic blood pressure is the same thing. The force of blood in the vasculature plus the force of the left ventricle. Because now we're in systole, now the left ventricle is contracting. Okay, so then go back up to our pulse pressure formula, systolic pressure minus diastolic pressure. So now we can just cancel, right? Do this, systolic minus diastolic. That's the force of blood in the vasculature plus force of the left ventricle minus the force of blood in the vasculature. In other words, this is going to cancel out of both of these. Pulse pressure is just the force of the left ventricle. That's why it's called pulse pressure. It's the pressure behind your pulse. If we're thinking about aortic regurg, let's think about this. This is our aorta right here. This is the aortic valve, and then this is the left ventricle. During systole, blood is in the left ventricle, and it's going to move out into the aorta as the heart contracts. During diastole, right, normally we have this valve here that's going to shut and prevent blood from returning back into the heart. It should not return normally, but this valve is not working. So here we've got this floppy valve that's going to let all this blood come rushing back in. One more thing I want to add up here, right? Don't forget about our mitral valve. So this is coming from the aorta, and we're going to pretend this is what the normal heart looks like. So the mitral valve is closed at this point during systole. So no blood is making its way through the mitral valve. But during diastole, right, the mitral valve is open. So now you have filling from two directions instead of just one. So your end diastolic volume is going to go way up. So EDV has to be increased. So it can't be B and it can't be E. What does that do to stroke volume based off of our formula? Well, if EDV increases, we're going to get rid of more volume during contraction. That's the Starling mechanism, Frank Starling. The more stretch you have on the heart or any muscle, the harder the contraction. So more EDV means more stroke volume. So again, stroke volume has to be increased. So we've eliminated 3 now between C and D. Lastly, it's pulse pressure. Let's go back here. During diastole, blood returns from the aorta into the left ventricle. Go back to your definition. What does that mean for the force of blood in the vasculature during diastole? Well, if you lose blood volume, then your diastolic blood pressure has to decrease. So right away, we know pulse pressure, diastolic, is going down. What about systolic? What's happening there? Well, during systole, if you increase your EDV, you're going to increase your stroke volume based off of our formula, which means you're going to get a lot more blood coming back out now, which means a lot more force of the ventricle. So you have more systolic BP and less diastolic BP. That results in a very large pulse pressure. And we actually see that in the question, 160/55. So even if you didn't know all that, I kind of gave it away by giving you the blood pressure here. Our pulse pressure is very wide, and this is very common finding in aortic regurg. So the answer here is choice C.